recording now. Okay. So then, there's my script for today. It says leg drive. It's got nothing on the sheet. Okay. I could quite easily spend a whole hour talking about leg drive, but guess what? I want you to tell me about it. But before we do that, how's it been going the last session? Tell me about the last session. Not Nikki, because Nikki, I know Nikki. How's it been going? Give me some feedback. Give us some feedback. Hello, Guy.
Hello.
Just say hello to Guy, by the way. Guy's from Glastonbury. Well, he's not from Glastonbury. He's in Glastonbury.
Well, my DNA is from close from here.
Okay.
Hi, Guy. How are you doing?
Hi, good.
Fortunately, Guy's got his shirt on today. This is good, actually.
Oh, it's freezing here.
But that's another story. Anyway, so how's the sessions been going?
Good. I think the sessions have been going really well.
Okay.
I enjoy them.
Define well. Tell me what
she works as hard.
Okay, what sort of things have you been doing?
45-degree entry and kicking off the back, using the power from the back to get forward.
Okay. So this back of the stroke business. What are we aiming to do with the back of the stroke? I'm not just not Chrissy. Anybody come in, or I might even nominate somebody. Who knows? So the back of the stroke.
So you're trying to make sure that you come out at the hip and not beyond that, because when you do, you're actually slowing down the boat. And what you want to do is you don't want to be losing your power at the back of the stroke, which is obviously one of the reasons why you do the light, heavy, light exercise, so that you can feel the difference when you're actually keeping the pressure on throughout the whole of the stroke. And you obviously you're wanting to exit at the same time with everybody else.
Okay, yeah. Anybody want to add anything to that? Joe, what do you think? Just to pick on Joe for a minute.
Well, it's also something I've been learning. It's really important with the timing as well. It's not just about when the paddle goes in, it's when the paddles go into the catch at the same time as well.
Yeah.
And also with regard to me, I've been using a longer paddle and it's gone up about like 3 inches. So I'm learning how to navigate that longer paddle into an efficient catch. So that's what I've been personally working on.
Okay, so are you now on what I call a full length paddle, 52 inch, 130? Yeah.
It's 51.
51. Okay.
It's a very good point about the. Sorry to butt in. The paddle length. On the dragon boat, I've always used the same paddle. There's a bit of echo there. Can someone turn off their sound when we're talking? Hello. Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Thanks. So when it was on the OC when I was paddling with Cherry from Tahiti. He was saying that it was a shorter paddle, I think a 48 or a 49 on an OC1 as you're sitting lower in the boat, and as soon as you get a short paddle, even as a tall paddler, and then lengthening the paddle when you go into a bigger boat. Actually, I've always used the same paddle, so it's a new area for me. I think. What do you think, Tim? Is that something that needs to be looked at? Length of paddle, depending on.
My take on it is maximum length, maximum leverage. So it's
right.
Different kettle of fish, and when it comes to OC, given that the nature of the water, especially if you're paddling on the sea, is a bit different. Your position in the boat is a bit different. The freeboard is different as well. There's only 6 of you in the boat, so that has less of effect than 20 people in the boat. But there's lots of paddle dynamic side of things. When it comes to dragon boat, suffice to say, as far as I'm concerned, maximum length, maximum leverage. The only people I would normally have in crews I manage or run are some of my breast cancer girls who have obvious upper body compromises, or very small people. My son, when he was 12, he was paddling with a full-length paddle. Probably because I was his dad, rather than our preference. But that's. But I'm interested in Joe's perception actually. So you've gone from a 48 to a 51. So what have you noticed as a difference? Because it's not so much what I say, it's what you feel, which is more significant.
Well, I think I was definitely apprehensive, but I actually took it onto my team boat today. I asked the coach if she was happy with that, and she was fine. So and by the end of the session, I found I could hear I was making a noise on entry, which was really annoying me, which I don't normally do with a 48. Yeah. I came off it feeling more confident. I think it really is practice makes perfect. So I mean, I hadn't gone up a tiny increment. I mean, I'd gone up like 3 to 4 inches. So it's going to take some getting used to, but I'm already can see the benefit. I can feel myself going into the 45-degree angle much more easily. I just need to work on my entry and make it a bit smoother and feel the benefit of that. You know, like you said, like the longer lever, feel the benefit of that and applying the power effectively.
It does make a bit of difference, but I've mentioned this before. John Purkier, who's probably well known to some of you who are OC paddlers, when he switched to the what's now everyone seems to do, the Tahitian style of paddling, he didn't do it twice and say, "Oh, it's crap," and gave it up. He did it for a year. So the message there is, if you change one aspect of your paddling, and you would have thought 3 inches isn't much, but it is actually quite a lot when you talk to paddling, other things will go out. So if you find your entry is a bit splashy, or you're coming in a bit more positive or neutral or negative, just stick with it and see it through and stick with it, and don't give up just because something else doesn't feel right. Expect other things, other parts of your stroke to go out of kilter a little bit, and then you just train into it. Yeah, so give it a good go. But
I definitely noticed that. I definitely noticed that one change changed everything for me, yeah. And I had to really push myself to keep practicing, and it is getting easier.
But my opinion on it, your trajectory would be there, but with a longer paddle, with the more power you can apply, you've got more capacity to go further. So that's where we're going with it. And that's whether you change leg position, whatever, always give it a really good go and try it and get bored and peed off with it, and then try again and then come back to it. So you're doing exactly the right thing. Great, glad to hear that. It does surprise me when you get some really big people, maybe, I mean, Guy's quite a big lad. You get people who are like 6 foot plus paddling with 48-inch paddling. It's like a matchstick. But because what tends to happen is, and Guy alluded to that, if you're transferring that from another water sport and you think OC and dragon boat are very close, and they're very close disciplines. However, there are some fundamental differences, not least of which what we're talking about here is the back of the stroke. That back end of the stroke from the mid thigh through to the hip doesn't actually, or shouldn't actually, exist in OC paddling, because at the nature of the paddle with the dihedral on it, it's out at that point. So if you get OC paddlers take that into a dragon boat, they're actually losing the back of their stroke. You see what I mean? So you just know what boat you're in. If you're out in a kayak, if you're in a kayak, paddle it like a kayak. If you're on a paddleboard, paddle like a paddleboard. Just know what you're in and use the correct technique, even though they're very similar. Okay. So thanks for that, Joe. Rachel, back of the stroke. What do you think about the back of the stroke? Have you been paddling back of the stroke?
So I haven't been paddling for the last few sessions. I've not been well.
Oh, sorry to hear that. Good, well soon. So who has been, and Cats as well, who has been paddling? Give me a bit of a feedback on the back of the stroke. Catherine, I'm gonna have to nominate people because you're all keen to volunteer.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's about the extra power at the back. You can certainly feel the difference. When we were doing as Michelle was saying, the light, hard, light, you can tell the difference between the power in the boat, and like with reminders, like we did quite the session yesterday, and then when Nikki reminded like to get the power up, remember the back of the stroke, you could feel again the difference with the reminders. So yeah,
it's hard, isn't it? It is. It's a very
hard, yeah.
anaerobic stroke.
Mm-hmm.
what's funny, we talk about the part of the drill that is heavy light. That's essentially how most people paddle. But when you break it down, you think, actually, I'm starting off, I've got a nice strong catch, and then it tails off, and maybe half of your stroke, half of the power phase of the stroke, the power is not actually, the paddle is not actually under load. And when you break it down like that, you're thinking, well, I've only got maybe 0.6 of a second per paddle stroke, and half of it, I'm not even getting any push off it. So when you sort of start thinking in those sort of terms, you start thinking, well, actually, there's a little bit more we can get out of this. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. I was going to say as well, it was easier then when thinking about the back of the stroke was the exit, which is lifting the hand up as well. So combining the two, the back of the stroke, and then that kind of the top hand bringing the paddle out, but the two of them combined certainly helped to think about it, to visualize it. I'll let somebody else go now.
Something that Nikki mentioned to me, and I think the question was, when you come out the back of the stroke, do you break at the wrist or break at the arm? I don't mean it in a flippant way. I don't even think about the back of the stroke, because I'm not thinking about what this bottom, if I'm paddling left side, I'm not worried about what this is doing. What I'm thinking about is going forward. You see what I mean? So I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about the recovery and the spring off the back, which is sprung with the kick off the back, and then I'm initiating this draw the sword, point the bow thing. So I just let the bottom hand sort of do its own thing. What I don't do is sweep it out. So once it's at my hip, I take all the pressure off that hand, and I'm leading with this hand, and this hand only comes in again when I kick the hip forward and then push with that hand there. You see what I mean? So this, you know, if I'm holding onto the paddle, one leads the other. Lead and then there. Okay. One thing that Michelle mentioned, which I think is worth Heidi May, we're going to say something there. Hang on. That pearl of wisdom we've just missed. I know what you said was brilliant, but I have to say it again.
It wasn't this last session. It was what the discussion has made me think about is something I did recently. We were doing 40s in the boat, and I was pacing at the front, and the girls were calling, Heidi May, you need to, you're not snapping forward quickly enough. And what I realized was that by focusing on the back end of the stroke, which I think I do relatively effectively, but I was holding on the back end of the stroke, which is, you know, is as bad as almost missing the back end of the stroke. So that was a real learning point for me on the 40s, was actually, it's all well and good getting the back of the stroke, but you can't waste that power by delaying and then, you know, floating forward, so to say. So that's been something that I've taken from the work that we've done, that I found really useful, actually.
So where are we taking the timing from? Front or back or somewhere in the middle?
Timing of what?
The stroke.
Well, the key thing is you've got to be the front. The key thing has to be the front.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, it has to be the stroke. One of the exercises though that we did, and I can't remember whether we did it with you, Tim, or not, is the actual snap exercise. It may have come from you, but we definitely did it in the Prem's in the last campaign when we were training, which is, it's just very, very simple. It's get the drummer or the steers just to call snap, and it just reminds everybody to snap it forward.
Right, yeah. Can't remember what we were doing in 2017. Yes and no. Snappy, yes. Get forward, yes. No problem at all. But what I don't want people doing is overdoing that effort. I mean, I'm very keen on the marginal gains, aggregation of marginal gains, and all this sort of stuff that goes back to Dave Brailsford, 2003, etc., etc. I think I mentioned this before. One of the previous senior team had this stroke called hang and bang. What it basically meant was they had a timing issue, timing and phasing issue. What they actually did was punch forward. Right? Now, I know what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to get people to snappily come forward. But if you think about it, if I'm going to punch forward, 60 strokes a minute, 150 times in a 500 meters, that's 150 punches I don't need to throw. So there's a difference between being snappy and getting forward, kicking off the back, which drives the boat, and actually doing something which is irrelevant to driving the boat. You see what I mean? It's a fine line. In the same way, you're going to be kicking off the back, but not going over beyond that point. So it needs a bit of discipline. So that's a variation of something we used to do. But yes, you've got to get off the back and snap forward. But I would now talk in terms of kicking off that wall of water, if you like. And that it essentially gets the same thing. But the idea is you're coming forward to hit the catch at the same time. Now, what do you think might happen if we took the timing off the back as opposed to the front? Because what a lot of people do is they got a little micro. So they delay.
Can we turn the mute on?
Yeah. Yeah, if you just go on mute and then come off mute when you want to speak. So what would happen if your timing was on the back as opposed to the front? If I'll ask Paul, because Paul mentioned it. So yes, we're going to take the timing off the front, but what would happen if it was off the back?
Well, that's not, you're depowering at the back to go forward. So, I mean, you've got people with different length of arms.
Yeah.
So we should naturally have a different length of paddle through the water. So you're going to affect the front of the stroke. Yeah. That's why you've got to hit together so the boat moves in that one motion together at the same time.
Yes.
When you're depowering at the back, when your power's on, the fact that somebody might have come out early, but the rest of the boat is powering through, doesn't affect the timing of the boat. I'm not saying it's right, but it doesn't affect the timing of the boat. Whereas when you catch, if people catch at a different time, totally affects the power of the boat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it also more important to have the timing at the front? Because if the timing is at the front, then you're potentially lifting the boat, which is what you want to do in order to glide.
Yeah.
Whereas if you come out, if it's, if you're doing it at the back, by the time you get to the front, the boat's going to settle back down.
Yeah, I mean, what I was getting at there, yes, is the timing may be the same, but the phasing will be out. I mean, Paul mentioned it, and it's a lot of people talk about the difference in terms of length of arms. Yeah, it might be the difference between my length of arm and say, I don't know, say Nikki, if we're paddling together, for argument's sake, we might have that much difference. It doesn't make that much of a difference, but of course what would happen is if I'm tracking back or hanging on the back and I'm coming forward here, then you have this sort of mishmash coming forward at a different point. And the coming forward thing might give you, as we mentioned a few weeks ago, if you're all coming forward together, then that's an incremental part of power that we can get some more drive out of the boat. So all just working together, the phasing, the timing, everything. But what people tend to do when they have a micro pause on the back, it tends to get longer. As they get more tired, then that pause gets longer, and you can see it because it's sort of the phasing drops out. And that's the problem or the benefit, which way you look at it, in terms of the spring off the back, because it gives you no pause off the back. And that, I'm wouldn't be surprised if people find it hard, because it is as I say, a total anaerobic stroke, and you've got to work hard all the way. It doesn't really work for 2K, but anything up to 2K, it works for. Yeah. Okay. Last little bit before we go on to legs. So what does it, when you're kicking off the back, springing off the wall of water, what does it look like? Nikki, what does it look like? You're still on mute. Just have to come off mute.
What, when you're springing off the back of the stroke?
Yeah. Or you're doing the heavy on the back?
Well, I mean, you can see that there's definitely a lot more power in the stroke. So and the boat kicks forwards. Right.
So you can feel that kick.
Yeah.
Right, because that's the really important part of this whole drill is when you break it down, you can feel the extra kick off the back, and it's a
Yeah.
positive kick as opposed to the boat should be springing rather than the boat should feel lighter.
Yeah.
You've almost got a two-part catch to it. That's the thinking of it. Okay. So what is it? So does anybody not feel that? Or not know what we're talking about here? Who would admit that? Okay, what does it look like? That's a bizarre question. What does it look like?
Looks nice and strong.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What does it sound like?
Well, it should sound quiet.
Absolutely. Right, that's the key to it. If you've got any splash off the back, then what's likely to happen is you've got cavitation on the blade and people going a bit too long. Like I say, the really important part to this, it goes to the back of the stroke, the hip, and that's it. If you remember when I showed you that quite complicated graph last week, got that negative impulse on the back. That's, you know, if you just take a paddle out, it's going to pick up some resistance on the water. So it's a couple of watts, couple of kilos rather. If you rip out the back, then the graph is like a massive negative part, and you can hear that. So if it's nice and well, relatively, you're going to get a little bit of cavitation, but if you've got a lot of cavitation or you've got a really big lump of water coming up or something, that's way too much. So it needs, it needs power, but it needs discipline with power. So we don't want somebody getting in there, head down, arse up, go for it and just rip a load of water out and create a big sort of fountain. No, we certainly don't want that. So, okay, fine. Okay, before I move on to legs, any other points? So do you think that's, do you think so far, do you think that for what you've done of it, the kicking off the back, do you think that's likely to work? If you think no, say no. Is it anything you've done anything like that before?
I think it's working well. I also like the analogy of drawing the sword because it helps us pull the paddle up to get into position again.
But it's not, I mean, it's so I'm paddling this way, I'm drawing the sword, and this hand, so this hand's leading, this hand's following. When I get to the hip, then I change over.
Yeah.
And that opens up the hip, which comes on to the next subject. So it's draw the sword, point the bow, changing hands. One leads, one follows. So this bottom hand leads or follows till I get past the hip, flick the hip forward, and then we go again. So that's that. Okay. It also means, yes.
Yeah, just you talking about the back of the stroke. I think we all know what we're supposed to do, and and it's something that Nikki and as a team we've talked about. Personally, I know if I'm tired, the back end of the stroke is the thing that's probably most likely to suffer more than the front end of the stroke. So when you get a call like sit up or heavy or whatever the call may be, I think that's really useful. For me personally, that's a really useful reminder to get the full length of the power to the full length of my stroke. I
mean, we mentioned this with Michelle a few weeks ago. And we always say this with our drummer cocktails. You know, what they say, it's not just a load of words in close formation. It's got to mean something.
Yeah. And
the heavy, for some reason, that's the one that gets people moving. We've tried all sorts of different things, but it's got to be, the command is short, sharp, to the point. So somebody can process in an instance and deliver it straight away.
Yeah, and I think particularly if you go off, we just raced at the weekend and our heat, we just went off like the clappers. It was ridiculous. And we totally missed the back end of the stroke because we didn't even have any leg drive because we were that fast. We were just too far forward. So yeah, I think the rate affects the rate and your level of fatigue. For me, I'm not speaking for everyone, it's been my own experience, definitely affects the integrity of the back end of my stroke.
Okay, but a good point actually. The integrity of the stroke, I like that. It's quite good. Nice term. That might use that again. Integrity of the stroke. So talking about the integrity of the stroke, because that is a great term actually. What actually determines the rate, your top rate? You know, some teams have a 500 rate, a 200 rate, a 2K rate. What's the highest rate you should go to? So what defines the highest rate you can paddle at? This is a question to anybody.
Well, as long as you don't lose power, you can go as quicker and quicker, but it tends to be the quicker you go, the stroke shortens. So you lose the catch, you lose the back of the stroke, the boat's dropping boat speed.
Not in this crew, it doesn't. Some other crew, maybe.
But what I'm
Optimal
saying
power.
is, if you're going too quick and you can't get a catch or the back of the stroke, then that's too quick. That's what I was trying to say.
That's exactly. So give me. So when you say power, give me another word. Which, yes, power. But there's more to this, and this leads me on to what I'm going to talk about next. What's the word that really talks about? Yes, you do lose power, but there's something else you lose, which begins with C.
Cadence.
Well, cadence is great, isn't it? So, but something.
Catch?
No.
No.
How about connectivity? The point at which, when you can do these rating exercises where you're doing 70, 80, 90 strokes a minute, there comes a point at which you're no longer connected with the boat. So basically, padding on your arms, so you may as well discount everything below your chest, because that's your just shoulders, arms, and you might get a high rate. And it's like you're in second gear. You're just wheel spinning. Yes, you're working hard, but it's not productive effort, or it's less productive effort. Which brings me on, the key part is that thing hanging out the bottom of your trousers, and I mean your legs. They're not just there for looking good, right? So here we are, leg drive. Second part of the little talk. Tell me about leg drive. What is the point? What is the point of leg drive? You hear about it. What's the point of it?
It's back to what you said about connectivity. So if you don't use your legs, you are trying to push yourself forward, rather when you use your legs, you're trying to push the boat forward. So there's a massive difference. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, perfect sense, but that may not make sense to everybody. So you might have to elucidate a bit further. So connectivity and legs. So yes, certainly. But what does that actually mean?
I talk about, trying to explain it, is sometimes people paddle from their belly button up.
Yes, most people do actually.
They just use the legs, so they're very army, and they just use the top of the body, which is not getting the whole drive. And that means they're trying to, I say, push themselves forward, rather than when it's the old analogy of trying to open a stiff door. You put your foot on the thing and you push with your legs. It's not your arms that are actually opening the door, it's your power through your legs.
Okay, and you can't open that door unless you've got some sort of connection on the door frame or whatever. So that's a very good analogy when you think about it. Opening a door, you've got to find some, so connectivity, purchase. You've got to get some purchase. And where does your power come from? So what is going on? So what are you moving in order to move the boat forward?
A lot of it comes from your hips. So obviously you're moving your outside shoulder forward, but you have to also rotate the hips, which actually pushes, the connection through your leg into the stirrup to create that kind of, you're doing it soft, but then you create the tension to drive back from it. If you haven't rotated your hips in towards your foot that's in your stirrup, then you've nothing to drive back from.
Okay, so bearing in mind the name of the game or the plan is to apply some force to the paddle, and in an ideal world you're moving the paddle backwards or really moving the boat past that point. You're locking the blade in the water. Would you agree with that? So if you're locking the blade in the water, you've got to lock it against something. So if you're using your opening a door analogy, then you've locked the blade in the water and then you're pushing against your door frame in order to apply that force. Okay, right, so there's your connectivity. Catherine, would you agree with that? When I say connectivity to you, purchase, what does that mean to you in terms of dragon boating in your experience?
As I think I've used this analogy before loads of times. It's about when I first was told about how to dragon boat, it was about imagine that you're trying to move it on sand rather than in water, that the water is solid. So you have to use levers as you say, connect the paddle with the water, and then connectivity with the boat. You're part of the boat, you're connected with the boat, and the idea is to drive the boat forward using your bigger muscles rather than your biceps, which are a lot weaker, if that makes sense. So that was my introduction to dragon boating, and that kind of stays in my head as well.
You do actually use your biceps.
Yeah, you do, but you use the main core mainly as bigger muscles, if that makes sense.
But maybe not the biceps you're thinking about. How many biceps have you got?
1, 2, like.
I bet you've got more than 2.
I know, 4.
4. Yeah. Well, where's the other 2 then? So you got
The
2 in your arms.
hamstrings.
Where are they?
Hamstrings.
Yeah. Bicep femoris, one of the big hamstring muscles. So you are using that a hell of a lot. Yeah. And my take on paddling hard, especially in single boats, if I get out of the boat, my biceps. If I get out of the boat, my hamstrings aren't singing. I'm not paddling hard enough. So if I'm powering up in a boat, and I talk about simple clues that you're looking for. So if I'm going at what I think is my top end level 4, level 5 level paddling, then I'm looking for certain feelings in certain parts of my body. And one of the main ones, especially in single boats, is my hamstrings. So absolutely. So you are really working your biceps really hard. Not those. Yeah. Those. Yeah. Okay. Fine. So this purchase. So yes to all of that. But when we're talking about the connection with the boat, I mean, you're sitting on a seat. So what do you actually, how do you achieve that connectivity? How do you achieve that purchase? Let's go to James. Thank you, Catherine.
Through your foot placement mostly, actually. So if you obviously you drive yourself forward, so you bend your knee into the stirrup position, as Paul said. But it's also about where you position your back foot, so that you actually you don't lift yourself off the seat, but you could almost lift yourself off the seat when the blade enters that catch, because you use your legs as the fulcrum to pull push the boat backwards. So you lock your blade in and you pull back. So for me, it's about your foot placement, and it's about when you reach the catch, applying the power to drive the boat forward, but also your back foot to make sure that the power is going down into the blade.
Okay, I paddle 1 foot forward. I don't paddle 2 feet forward. I'll come on to that in a minute.
Yeah, I'm 1 foot forward.
The terminology there, leg in the stirrup. What do you mean by that?
Against the side of the footrest, the foot block.
Right. Okay.
That I think that's what Paul meant. The stirrup is being the foot block.
It's a good analogy. What part of the foot are you pushing with?
For me, I tend to mix it up a little bit, but mostly I try and have the balls of my feet onto the stirrup, because so at the beginning of the stroke, my full foot will be there, and I use that for the majority of the leg drive. But then I also try and come back onto the balls of my foot just to get that little bit extra. Particularly now we're doing it at the back of the stroke, because I'm also emphasizing trying to make sure that when I have that kick and lifting the blade out coming forward, it's at the same time that when my foot reaches the balls of the foot, I know that's almost the time to swing the hip forward, pull the blade out of the water, and go forward.
Okay, what sort of boat are you paddling? What's the make?
It's a Champion, I think.
Oh, right. So when you say stirrup, you mean the little ridge? Oh, I know what you mean now. Right. Okay. Heidi, May, do you agree with pushing off the ball of your foot, or some other part, or some of it will depend on how long your leg is? I know, but
well, I don't know what's right or wrong, but I don't push from my ball. I push from my heel. I was just thinking actually about the rowing machine. For me, the greatest power comes from pushing from the heel, because that's where you're most going to recruit your hamstrings.
Why
toe
would
is-
that be?
Well, the toe flexion just activates your gastrocnemius, and that's just a
Yeah.
small muscle compared to your hamstrings, I would say.
I mean, it depends on the length of your foot, your length of your legs, etc. And people use foot blocks. If you think about that being a foot, if you're pushing off there, then you're pushing through an extra joint. It's far better. I like the idea of pushing in a pretty much straight line. So when I'm actually at full extension, well, yeah, pretty much full extension, then there's a straight line between my heel and my hip. That's what I find that but it's one of the things you've got to try yourself. I find that the line of least resistance, if you like, the straightest line is as far as I'm concerned, is the strongest. In the same way, I know it's more stable, but if you're on a leg press machine, so a sitting leg press machine, then if you think about it, you've got your whole foot on the plate, but you're really pushing with the heels, aren't you? Really, you could do it with the toes, but you get a stronger push if it was pushing with the toes rather than pushing with the heels. You get a stronger, more stable position if you're pushing with the heels. So I'd certainly try that if you're not already doing that. If you're an OC paddler, it's different again. And another difference there between OC and dragon boat. But if you've got a stirrup or something you can push off that's in a straight line, then I would try for that. The other thing is, so if I'm sitting in the boat's going in a straight line. Do I want to be pushing straight back, or what happens if my leg's off at an angle? That way or that way? You get people sitting in all sorts of bizarre sort of positions. What do you ideally want to be achieving?
Straight line.
I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? It's the straightest line once again, because also when you think about it, you're driving from the heel through to the power, and really by the time you get into the hips, that's where the power is. So if you introduce different angles, then you're twisting the hip, over twisting, over rotating, and you're putting the same. You're trying to over rotate for the same effort. So I'll try and get the line of least resistance on doing not the minimal effort, but the minimal effort to achieve the same outcome. Yeah, I know somebody in Cyprus who's convinced the way to paddle is by having their foot on the seat in front. Now, apart from annoying the person sitting in front, the way the body is, it's configured to push in that direction. It's not so, if you're sitting back, it's not the same. With a leg press machine, you're pushing off the back. You've got something on your back support. But the actual angle is different as well. Okay. Why? Some people, and we might have touched upon this. I'll come back to 2 legs forward in a minute. 1 leg forward in a minute. But why? What about 2 legs forwards? Give me some pros and cons of paddling 2 legs forwards.
The 1 leg forward already promotes the rotation in the angle of which you're going to rotate, and then recoil backwards and the recoil back into the start position. 2 feet forwards, you could have a power source, I guess, but it's it'll be more natural to have, especially paddling on from one side, to have the outside leg forwards so you can get the maximum reach from your arm as well. It leads, including the whole body and the torso, with including your arm. Gives you a few inches.
So some of the teams, I believe it's the Canadians, when they start, they have both feet forward because their start piece is a very rapid start piece, and they don't actually want to be rotating, and they don't want to be moving their body forward and back, and so therefore they get macked because they're driving off both feet. But then they obviously then change, and then after the start piece they then put one foot forward. So there is an advantage
completely
to having both feet forward for the start of the race, potentially.
Right, when we say the Canadian stroke, there's probably 4 different Canadian strokes. There's one Canadian stroke where they start with half a blade buried. There's different people do different things, so to achieve different purposes. But just dealing with, I'm going to come back. I like the idea of recoil. In fact, I use that myself when we're talking about one leg forward, but just dealing with the 2 legs forwards for a minute. I'm looking for any advantages or disadvantages of that. So potentially one, if you're not rotating, it doesn't matter. And that's probably a bit of a clue there. If you're not rotating, you're just going for a high cadence, maybe to get the boat speed up, perhaps. Maybe. Any other advantages to 2 legs forward that you can think of, or disadvantages? Anybody?
I feel it. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, when we paddle long distance, I quite often have to put both legs forward after a while because of I've got sciatica one side, and I just find that with both legs forward, I definitely don't get the leg drive, and I feel like the inside leg, you're kind of bracing yourself a bit, so it seems to take a lot more effort because you're not sort of locked in as well. So I definitely used up some energy trying to brace myself because I don't feel as well locked in.
Yeah,
with 2 legs forward.
I think that's a really good point. You tend to, there might be some benefits to it, but you certainly lose some connectivity. And we'll come back to the geese recoil point, which is a really, I use that myself. It's a very, very good point. Okay, so you might lose some connectivity. Any, you might have some advantages on the first few strokes. I'm not convinced of that, but okay, I'll take any considerations. Any other advantage or disadvantages to 2 legs forwards?
Yeah, just I'm a bit like Jenny. I've got arthritis in my knees, so sometimes I just have to release my leg to just release my arthritis. But yeah, I mean, it's not an advantage. It's just something I occasionally have to do.
For what it's worth, on a longer distance race, I'll paddle 1 leg forward, the other leg forward, both legs forward, whatever. Yeah, especially on OC again, I'll swap every set. But just for the connectivity side of things,
I suppose there's a potential advantage if you've got both feet forward that you're using 2 sets of muscles as your leg drive rather than 1 set of muscle. Also, I suppose theoretically speaking, you're putting some of that power more into the center of the boat rather than to the outside of the boat. So again, there's a possibility you may be pushing the boat further forward if you were driving from, if you say, if let's say you moved it the other way around and you had your outboard leg back and your forward leg forward, you'd be more centered into the boat possibly, so maybe we wouldn't get as much of a rock, possibly, don't know.
Okay, I mean, all these things have advantages and disadvantages. So potentially, if you think in terms of the leg press analogy, you could potentially get some increased raw power. There's a downside to that, of course, but there might be some increased raw power that you can deliver. But what's the tendency, if you think about it? So I'm sitting in a boat, I've lost a bit of connectivity, so I haven't got that suspension or that recoil or cocking of the hips. If I'm going to be pushing forward, what's the big drawback? Well, what's a potential drawback of sitting 2 legs forwards?
Probably leaning back too much. Rocking. You're not stable.
Right, but both of those, I mean, Guy and Michelle, yes. So you may have some raw power, but what are you pushing against? Yeah, you'll push off. In order to get the power, you're going to have to lean forward in order to deliver it. So you end up with this falling forward motion. So I'd say very often the downside is probably may end up taking off more than the top side. So even if you could achieve that by rocking forward, what's a big problem about rotating at the hip?
You bounce the boat, power's going in the wrong direction.
Okay, and what else in terms of the catch point or the angle of entry?
You start to invert way too soon.
That's the big problem with it. And yeah, when we say when you're hinging, and I people use this term, yeah, we've talked about this before. It's not actually a hinge, is it? You're actually rotating around a hip. That's not quite the way the hip works. You're not just rotating down. There's a rotation that goes on here as well. So you're not just rotating down into the water. There's an articulation there. It doesn't stay up completely, but you're trying to keep your arm up as much as possible so you get a further reach. Okay, even those Canadians, Americans who say 2 legs forwards is the only way you can paddle. I get all that, I understand it, and I'm very happy to analyse, try anything. However, even those people I've come across who profess that's the only way to paddle still have a leading leg. And you might find they're actually pushing one foot against the other. So even though they're 2 legs forwards, they're not actually, as James suggests, you know, ideally you'd be pushing equally with both legs. What they're actually doing is they've got one leg slightly in front of the other and they're still driving off one. And you're thinking, well, if you're trying, what you're actually doing is losing the ability to actually rotate the hip. So they're like it's sort of that sort of thing rather than a big rotation. Now that's my observation. That's just one observation. So so if that's the case, or what I've seen, what would be the advantages of or disadvantages of paddling 1 leg forward and 1 leg back, whichever way you do it? So I'll just come to Guy first. You mentioned recoil. What's that? I like that analogy. What's that all about? The recoil side of things.
Right. It's been a while since I've been in a boat, but the fact that you're pushing off and you're rotating the hip, pivoting the hip as you're coming through the stroke, when you release it, you've got the leg that comes forward, the knee that comes forward again as it relaxes, and that automatically gives you lift out of the water. It helps, not just it's like in the recovery period. So that's part of it, and it's also part of and I think the instability aspect is not really there. I think that's depending on whether you're a novice, because when you're doing a lunge on dry land with a heavy weight on your back, you can get very, very heavy weights with a barbell. You don't have any. You've got to be absolutely centered, right? So I don't think that's an issue with 1 leg forward, because in a lunge on dry land you have that you don't have that specific element. So you've got to remember that when you're in the boat, you're in the lunge, yeah. Right? So stability, and the only thing is you've got your reach and your torso and your arm and your hands and the fingers that enable you to get that catch at the front, all aiding you to get the extra inch, right, without overreaching, maintaining absolute strength.
I think it's a good analogy. Lunging is a good analogy, because if you think about the power phase of the stroke is a strong derotation, isn't it? But in order to come to that strong derotation, or to initiate that, you've got to have a strong, stable rotation. And I like the idea, whether you're paddling left leg forward, right leg forward, whatever, that each paddler, I've mentioned this before, is an independent, efficient paddling unit. If you're unstable, if you're sort of pitching and rolling too much, then somebody else has got to equalize that. And normally it's the steerer. So if the boat's unstable, the steerer is spending a bit more time stabilizing the boat, putting a stick in the water when the stick should be out the water. So if we spend more time thinking about stability, front, back, left, right, synchronicity, that sort of stuff, and people are moving independently, not independently, but in a balanced sort of way, so you're rotating sufficient to get yourself forward, but not overdoing it. You're not sort of smashing forward, stopping, and then paddling back. It's just enough effort to get you forward. And my observations over the years is that the only way you're going to get that done is by having a nice, it's a bad analogy, it's like an artillery gun. If you ever look at artillery guns, on the top of a gun it's got 2 things called recuperators. So the gun fires, and these recuperators relay the gun, so it doesn't bounce all over the place. It puts it back where it should be. And the idea is you drive off the front leg, and with the back leg, when you come forward, it just resets. So it's not a great analogy, but you see what I mean. That movement between front and back is exactly what it's doing. That push and pull. It's not just push and then lunge. You're setting up, you're driving, and then you're resetting. That's my take on it. That's my take on it. What's your take on it?
I agree with you.
I much prefer these sessions where I'm asking you questions and you're telling me. It's much more interesting rather than me.
I'm not sure what else there is. I think you've said it all.
Well, but what does it, when you're doing that, what does it, how does it feel? And I mean, it might sound like a daft question, but when you're paddling, 2 legs forwards and you're stable, how does it, I mean, that's stable, that's the answer. What, does it feel stronger? Does it feel more connected? Does it feel less connected? Does it feel like you're going to fall off the seat?
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk for me. I feel restricted, and for me, it stops me getting that. Nikki, what's the phrase that you use when you say something about our hip? You've got a phrase, it's a new one to me, but you say something like open the hip or extend the hip. What's the phrase?
Got to get me in the boat and I'll remember.
You said it last 3 or 4 weeks, something like opening that hip, leading with that hip. But it's all, for me, it's about getting that hip forwards. But if I've got, so my point is, whatever Nikki says makes
early hip rotation.
Early hip rotation to get that open position. If I've got 2 legs forward, I immediately lose early hip rotation.
There's a he's retired now. He's a professor. Imre Kamecki. He's a Hungarian kayak paddler and coach from the 60s. He talks about early rotation, earlier. So that's where that would come from originally, because he's the only person who talk about that. So that's but what does that actually mean? Yes, absolutely. But I rotate. Why earlier? What is that all about? Yes, absolutely. But what does it mean?
It's just
when Nikki says it, what is it leads, about? What are you about?
It's from the hip, from that hip, that early slight millisecond forwards. Everything else, your body then leads up the torso and up to the arm, up to the shoulder, and then around, opposed to any jolting. Yeah. So as you're moving your leg forwards, that brings that hip forward, then the rest follows.
Okay. Yes.
I was going to say that for me, 2 legs forward doesn't work, but when I'm thinking about the hip rotation creates a bend in my leg, which then means I have a stronger connection into my foot, which means then that I can use my leg like a spring, and I can push myself back using that leg bend to best effect. That's
is any yes, absolutely. Is anybody here a kayak or surf ski paddler?
Surf ski.
Right. Well, surf ski, when you think about it, you're pumping your legs, aren't you?
Yeah.
When one leg's extended, well, depends. I've never seen you paddle. I'm assuming that when you're like, and that's what Joe's talking about. I think as one's pushing forwards, you're creating the hip rotation, the hip extension.
Yeah.
It's that sort of rocking motion that we're doing.
It's like a boxer's jab. Boxer's jab actually leads from the hip. It doesn't lead from the shoulder. You gotta lead from the hip first.
Well,
so
absolutely. I don't know if you mentioned this before. When an exercise I do with people, I get them to come and punch my hand. And you always get somebody, and then they sort of do like a rabbit punch. They say, really punch my hand. Really punch my hand. Now punch my hand through and they start punching from the hip. Now this is where that rotation is good, but what we don't want people doing is punching their way down a race course. What you want to do is activate the hip in order to get the reach. Of course, with this case, it's like a reverse punch because the power comes on the derotation. But that's exactly right. And the way we do it is when we lead with this hand, and when I say flex the hip, that's what that's doing. That point the bow business is actually opening up the hip, or earlier hip rotation, because that's exactly that, and setting up in the same way you would if you were punching, but without punching. So you're doing the movement without punching out and using a load of effort and energy to get forwards. So yes. Okay.
One of the things I've noticed from when Nikki shouts out, and she makes sure she tells us the early hip rotation also aids in us making sure we bring the blade out, so we don't invert the blade. You know, we're not coming back too far in the stroke. That's something Nikki always basically says, you know, early hip rotation, because if you get that, you're automatically, as you're rotating your hip forward, you're already bringing you're already drawing the sword and bringing the blade forward.
Okay.
I find it very advantage. It's good when she shouts that one to us.
We're just coming up. I want to show you 2 exercises. We're just coming up on an hour. Early hip rotation is a really good, or let me just show you something. Right. Reposition here. Just watch yourselves for 1 minute. Okay, right. You're all familiar with doing a Russian twist, okay? So normally when you do a Russian twist exercise, depending on how you do it, you'd have your legs up, okay? If you're doing that sort of thing. Can you try it? You need a decent weight. Do a Russian twist, but keep your legs on the ground. Keep that connection. And what you're actually doing is pumping the legs when you do it, yeah? So you're getting used to that idea that you're pushing. You see what I mean? Rather than having your legs in the ground, you've got it's a closed chain exercise, so legs stay on the ground. And what you're doing, it's a good kayaking exercise. So when you're kayaking, or James in his surf ski will be punching both legs. So rather big weight or a smaller weight. But the idea is you keep your legs on the ground and you get the idea that you're pumping the legs, okay? That's one. The second one, hang on, let me get my resistance band. You may have seen this. Okay, resistance band exercise. Double the resistance band over. And what we're doing, I call it a dragon boat hip flex. Holding the band like that, up and down, up and back. So what you're not doing, you're from here, this hand doesn't go beyond the hip. You open the hip up, so lead with the hand, point the band, draw the sword, point the bow, and then drive up and back. So what you're doing is you're opening up the hips and then pushing, driving back, yeah? Do you know what I mean? Do you see what I mean? Now, what I'd like you to do, this hand doesn't go beyond the hip. So same as, it's like you're holding a paddle. It's the same sort of length there. Up and forward, up and back. And then you can do it both sides and both legs as well. But what you're actually practicing is opening up the hip, getting the relationship with opening up the hip and getting forward, and then driving with the quad and the hamstrings to get back to that position there. So you're not doing that. Yeah, it's not a dragon boat stroke. It's open the hips, lay it down. Now, if you notice what I'm doing, I've got my head up and I'm pointing with this finger. So I'm looking where I'm pointing. But what I'm trying to do is rotate around about the hips and the shoulder as well. I'm not just going into the water. Okay, so you're up, lay it down. So my head's still up and back. Okay, so you get that connection between open up the hips, laying the thing down, and then driving with the quad on the return. Yeah? Yes, no, looking at me quizzically. What's he on about? I hate the term. Does that make sense? Something like that. Some exercises that basically, it's neural pathways rather than muscle memory. It just gives you the connection between when I'm coming forward, my head is still up. I'm not coming down here somewhere. I come to my full extension, then I'm driving in a straight line up again. That's what that is about. And if I was the doctor of paddling, I'll prescribe 50 of those every day. Both sides. But yeah, I'm not a doctor of paddling, but if I was, but something like that with a resistance band, you can do it with the paddle as well, just to get the idea that you see the relationship between up, point, up, back, up, point. Good for the shoulders as well. And if this hand is up, then this hand will rotate nicely. And that's it, really. On that happy note, that's all I've got to say. Okay, that's it. That's 1 hour done. Any points? Any points? Does that make? I hate this term, but does that make sense? It's a bad coaching term, isn't it? Does that make sense? Is it? It's a closed question anyway. So Heidi May, thoughts, cogitations?
Conjutation. No, it all makes sense, and it all reinforces, you know, the work that we're doing with Nikki. So yeah, no, great, thank you.
Well, that I'm gratified to hear that. Fantastic, thank you, Paul, Chrissy. In any order?
All good for me. Makes sense.
Chrissy, was I rambling on today, or was it sort of? Did we go around in circles? I'm joking.
No, that's what I
Okay, good. Paul, okay.
Yeah, all good.
Nikki.
Everything's good.
Yeah.
Happy. Yep.
I'm so glad we're talking the same language.
So am I.
Okay, brilliant, fantastic. Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, all good with me. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank
Yep.
you. Catherine, is it Catherine or Kat?
Only one addition we didn't talk about was with the leg drive, when it comes, it's got to come after the catch. And one thing that Nikki always says is don't leg drive too early, like, because you've got to get the catch, otherwise it causes the
Right.
wave thing. That's the only thing extra that Nikki's very strict
Say
on.
that again, just so I understand what
Make
you're
sure
saying.
that we've got the catch and then the leg drive, because we've talked a lot about leg drive. It's got to come, or you can't. You've got to bury the blade first, basically, before you leg drive.
Right, there's a difference there.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Right, so what do you mean? It's
Bury
worth
the
spending-
blade, then the leg drive. But
Right.
anyway, we're going to talk about this next time. Just everything's good.
That's
Before they kill me.
a big one.
Right, okay, we're going to talk about this next week, right? Before you put the power on, the blade has got to be fully buried. Is that what you meant?
If you start to leg drive too early, what it has done is caused cavitation. So,
right.
You mean bounce?
Yeah, bounce. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's quite what we're talking about there is quite a crucial thing, and we'll talk about that next week. But yes, absolutely. So, blade, before you put the power on, the blade's got to be fully buried. Yeah. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Don't have just no. Do you no, Catherine? Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
You don't have to.
No, yeah, I do. This is why I brought it up. We were talking about leg drive, and that was the other thing that Nikki's always going on about with leg drive. When you leg drive.
With good reason, absolutely,
Yeah.
Absolutely critical. The timing of that power phase is really important. If you fire it too early, another shooting analogy. It's like any of you have done any shooting, target shooting, with a shot when it comes, it's almost like a surprise. You don't want to be snatching it. So the timing of it is crucial. So the analogy is if you hit the catch and snatch the catch, it's like snatching the trigger. Yeah, okay. Next time, yes, absolutely. Cool. Brilliant. James, thank you for that. Thank you. James.
No, all good, sir.
Good. Joe?
Very good, thank you. Yep.
Brilliant.
Useful session.
Rachel and Kat? Michelle? Lovely hair. Guy?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks,
Thank
Tim.
you. Well, as soon as we can, meet up, because we're allowed to travel, then we'll catch up, and I'll bring the OC2 down. No worries.
That'll be brilliant.
Last but not
Fantastic.
least, Abigail.
Yep, all good with me. I think these sessions are great, sort of consolidating what we do with Nikki on the boat. So it's a great way to circle back and consolidate our knowledge.
Circle back, that's something come out of America, isn't it? Everyone's talking about circling back these days. Starkey. Okay, well, I'll circle back to you next week then. Brilliant.
Sounds
Right.
good.
Thanks a lot. See you later.
Thanks all. Thanks,
Cheers.
Tim.
Cheers. Bye. Have a good time. Cheers.